is all about higher level cognition. And so we're really talking about analysis, evaluation, and synthesis. So in this class, these three terms, analysis, evaluation, and synthesis, are all in this higher level thinking category, and they all deal with what we're going to call deep structures. So complex concepts or ideas and principles all have these things in common, and that's what we mean by deep structure. So when we think of tables, tables all have some things in common that make them a table, even though they can be different sizes, shapes, made out of different materials, different colors, and so on. Similarly, if you think about it, all romantic comedies have the same deep structure, names, settings, situations, whether they're superheroes or kids or adults, doesn't matter. There is the contentious relationship, followed by the initial interest, followed by the utopian phase, followed by the falling out, followed by the wisdom scene, followed by the renewal and coming back together. And that's it. There's a quirky friend. There's a wise person who dispenses the wisdom, usually, either a random person or somebody who has up to that point been comic relief, things like that. Dogs, again, same thing. Big, small, long hair, long tail, short tail, floppy ears, pointy ears. But there is something that makes them a dog. And same thing, songs have the same thing. Word problems, democracies, all these things have a thing that makes them, or characteristics that make them the thing that they are. And that's what we refer to as the deep structure. Now, the surface structure is going to refer to those specific details of the U.S. democracy, or of, the How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days romantic comedy, or a schnauzer for a dog, right? That's the surface structure. The surface structure can change, and when we're dealing with application and things like that, we typically are changing. We're talking about a single deep structure. We're not really talking about how it's different from other deep structures, but we expose somebody to many different surface structures. So when we think about analysis, the key points to this is that a student needs to be on their own without any help or direction. First needs to be able to identify the deep structure of a concept. So the shift between application and analysis is, in an application problem, I say find the quotient and the remainder. And that means that I'm asking you to use your division word problem skills to do this. In an analysis task, I don't tell you what kind of problem it is, and you have a variety of strategies that you have to have mastered that you can select from and that you can maybe even string together. Key elements, they need to be internalized and self-directed. And we can teach this in a couple different ways, and this is going to be echoed in one of the articles that you're reading. First of all, one, point out the deep structure. And do this explicitly, directly, by looking at many different surface structures and comparing them to each other. So I compare my surface structures and talk about what they all have in common, and then I contrast it with other deep structures and how they're different. Then I give them lots of practice with this discrimination task. And then I continue on with as many deep structures as I need to cover. If I'm talking about different governments and I want my students to be able to analyze or classify what type of government a country is based on a bunch of different characteristics, that is an analytic strategy. If I am looking at word problems and sometimes they're addition, multiplication, subtraction, that's an analytic task if I don't tell them what they're supposed to be doing. If sometimes they, need, and say we're doing like geometry and I'm doing angle proofs, and sometimes you can use side angle side, side, or whatever, but they need to know what they're supposed to use and then be able to do it. When we think of other examples, you can look at, these that are described here, And we have, this idea of within math, it's really easy to talk about. In other areas, it might be a little more difficult. And so, like if I'm teaching a creative writing class, an application strategy is the use of metaphor. Or if I'm writing persuasive essays, I may want them to use a particular rhetorical device. The analytic task is where they have to decide what strategies they're going to be using, or what type of essay they're going to write, or whether a metaphor or maybe alliteration or some other literary device is most appropriate to cause the effect that they are trying to cause. Much more complicated. The thing about these types of levels of cognition is that you typically can't reach them in a single lesson. When we talk about lesson goals, we're typically talking about comprehension or application. But when you are trying to build towards analysis, there's simply not enough time to start from scratch and get there in 50 minutes. So keep that in mind as we go forward. When we think about assessing at higher levels of cognition, one of the rules we're going to talk about is that the higher the level of complexity, especially when we get into these analytic tasks, the less cued or less structured the task can be. So in order to assess at the higher level thinking versions of Bloom's taxonomy, I need three different things. One, novelty. The student cannot have seen this specific problem before. It needs to be similar to other deep structures that they have seen, but we can't have done this in class exactly. Otherwise, it's application. The second, self-direction. The student can't have a checklist. They can't ask me. All the structures and skills and strategies have to be in their heads. Otherwise, I reduce it to a bunch of application tasks. Finally, effectiveness. The student has to be successful. Now, can they demonstrate some kind of mastery by getting some parts right and some parts wrong? Sure. But then they're not really meeting the goal. The goal is for them to be able to do everything. So, when we talk about this idea, it's easy because I'm trying to make sure that there are no misunderstandings, that I give really detailed instructions. And that's good for reliability and understanding, but it's bad for assessing at the right level of cognition. I need to dial back the structure or the prompts that I give my students in order to see if they have it organized in their head how it's supposed to be organized. Otherwise, I'm just telling them how to organize it. And one of the key things about higher level thinking is I am relying on them to already have all these things in their place. And that's why it takes so much time and practice to get them there. I can't expect that to happen in one day. Maybe at the end of the week if I'm really good and careful. Some samples of this, a very loosely, structured version if I want to assess this goal of whether or not students will be able to analyze how human activities cause succession in an ecosystem. In other words, how it changes an ecosystem. A little structure prompt says, in the space below, describe in detail the different aspects of succession that will result from deforestation. Giving them an example. We've talked about these types of things before. I'd probably want to throw in a specific ecosystem as well, so they know things about rainfall, seasons, things like that, growth rates, whatnot. Moderate structure, still okay. I'm adding a little bit more, and I'm adding in a response limit. I'm adding in a few things about describing what it is, what succession is, and also making sure they talk about direct and indirect. Too much structure is where I start to organize the response for them. Again, this is reducing it to a series of application tasks. And by this point, I may as well just make it into a multiple choice test, because I'm losing my ability to see how students organize things in their head. when I get to these levels of cognition, analysis, evaluation, and synthesis, I'm really interested in whether or not my students have organized structures existing in their minds. And the only way to do that is for me to make it loosely defined enough so they can demonstrate how they organize it.